Hey, what's up, YouTube? Today, I'd like to discuss a debate Destiny's had with two pro-life supporters and get into why I really don't agree with his stance here. For a bit of a background, I really like Destiny overall, but I think he's, let's say, misguided on the topic of abortion and trans issues. But we'll save the latter for another video. So, without further ado, let's dive right in.
What is your basic stance on abortion?
My basic stance is we try to figure out what is a person, what makes a person. Person is granted some positive, some negative rights by governments, and probably morally and ethically separate from governments, we also grant people some type of right. I don't believe that a person is a collection of cells. I don't believe that a person is just a body with a brain. I think that very specifically when we speak about a person, we speak about something that has the capacity to deploy a conscious experience, because that tends to be the thing that we're usually talking about when we're figuring out if somebody's alive or dead, or whether or not somebody ought to be protected. When we say a person, when we say who is suffering, we don't say what is suffering. We're not talking about a body. We're not talking about a heartbeat. We're talking about a person having an experience. So when I try to think of abortion, I try to think of who is being harmed. I would say that for 20 to 24 weeks, that's about when the scientists say that the brain has all the parts necessary to begin communicating, to have a conscious experience, that about at that point, there is some experience there that we can speak of as a who or as a person. But prior to that, the first trimester, that really experience is not happening yet. So if you want to have an abortion, there is no who that's being harmed. There's just a what, which is whatever the body is up to that point. So generally, I'm pro-choice, the first abortion, up until that conscious experience has been formed, because I think that's what's worth protecting, because that's when we look to see when somebody's dead. So that's what we should look to see when somebody's alive.
So are you anti-abortion after 20 or 24 weeks?
Yeah, after 20 to 24 weeks.
And all abortions, anti-all abortions after 20 to 24 weeks?
With the obvious exceptions of like ectopic pregnancies or life of the mother or something like that being threatened, yeah. Yeah. Easy, yeah, of course.
Okay.
And your positions on...
So we share a position, but Kristen, I'm sure will have her way she wants to describe it. I think that all humans have human rights. That's right. By nature of being a human, you are a member of the human family. And so any member of the human family, and this is actually the preamble of the Declaration on Universal Human Rights by the United Nations. So for those that think they have any authority, I don't know if you do, Destiny, they say that all members of the human family deserve to be protected and treated by the law as persons. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a member of the human family, you have human rights. And we know when you become a member of the human family, it's at the moment of fertilization. It's very clear. A single cell embryo comes into existence. And so I believe human rights for all humans. And I also want to build a society of love and justice. And the way to do that is to treat people equally under the law and to protect the most vulnerable, especially children.
As you can see, the two parties have very different definitions regarding what constitutes the object of human rights. Destiny believes that an individual becomes worthy of human rights the moment it becomes a person, and it becomes a person at around the 20 to 24 week pregnancy mark. At this point, it doesn't even matter whether that's actually accurate or not. What matters is that Destiny's position is that an individual should only receive human rights, including that to life, the moment it becomes a person, not the moment it becomes a human. Because, as Destiny stated himself, the two do not coincide. You first have a human, which eventually becomes a person at the 20-24 week mark. You get the point. The two women's position is simpler. The individual should be given protection under the law the moment it becomes a human being, which happens when the unique DNA is formed, which is at conception.
Brain activity that's been in a hospital for 3 months. That's a much different position to take because you're not actively killing that person. You may say we have to withdraw life support for this reason, or the doctor may say we have this reason to believe this person is brain dead, but you're not actively killing. You don't say, well, they're going to die, so I'm going to take a gun and put it through the person's head. We would not say that. We would say we might withdraw life support and see if the person can sustain life on his or her own, but we're not going to actively dismember them in the process or violently kill them in the process. But that's exactly what abortion is. It's not just easily withdrawing life support. It's actively going into a womb where there's a developing human being that biologist tells us is a unique, whole, living human being that's never existed before and will never exist again, and it's actively killing them.
Okay, I don't believe that you believe in that argument. If I were to show you that all abortions could be done by just extracting the baby and then leaving it on the table and not actively killing it, but just removing it from the mother's life support and seeing what happens, would you be okay with that?
That is actively killing it.
That is killing it.
Because
How is that actively killing any more than pulling the plug on
Destiny,
somebody?
Actually, removing the baby from the mother's womb would most definitely qualify as active killing, because you know that the baby cannot survive any other way. You're moving the baby from an environment or a situation that keeps it alive and place it in a situation that will 100% kill him. There's no difference between that and removing a diver's oxygen mask underwater and watching him drown, for instance. The certainty of death is the same, and in both cases you have active killing. You could argue that pulling the plug on a dying patient also qualifies as active killing, sure. However, there's a crucial difference between the two cases. The dying patient is dying, the fetus is not. This makes the situations entirely different, at the very least on a moral plane. The fetus is on a life support machine, to put it like that, as part of its natural developing cycle. The end of the cycle coincides with the fetus becoming self-sustaining to some degree. The dying patient is on the life support machine because we put him there to prevent him from dying. The end of the cycle coincides with the patient dying. This critical difference makes the situations completely non-analogous. I think a better analogy for active versus passive killing would be to know that the fetus is experiencing issues in the uterus that put its life at risk and not intervening. If the fetus dies, that is passive killing. You could have intervened, but you didn't. But when you remove the fetus from the uterus and leave it out to die, that's you involving yourself in the process and taking actions that result in the fetus's death. So I'm not quite sure what Destiny is on about here.
The question that I said, I would originally ask you this question again, and I'm going to ask you the question again because nothing that you said addressed it. And my question was, and I'm going to repeat it, a person that is in a coma that will never wake up, should that person be indefinitely kept alive on life machines?
It depends on what are the characteristics of them in that
The
coma.
characteristic is
Was
that the
that a
person's
medically
body.
induced coma?
The characteristic is the person's in a coma. They're never going to wake up, but their body is still.
How do you know they're not going to
How
wake
do
up?
you know they're never going to wake up?
The problem is,
Because
Destiny,
the scientist has a magic machine that he pushes a button, and the machine says this person is never going to wake
You're coming
up.
up with a magical scenario.
So, Destiny's goal with this analogy is to make the two say no. In which case, the conclusion would be, see, so you don't care about the human body or the notion of humanity, but about the person, the individual capable of experiences. Because you know that the individual will never wake up, you know they won't ever have any experiences, in which case you see no problem with disconnecting them from the machine. The problem with this analogy is precisely the fact that we know the individual will never wake up. To put it simply, the fetus and the comatose patient are similar in one aspect and different in another. On the one hand, they both lack consciousness. The fetus hasn't developed one yet, while the comatose patient no longer has one. Their status is identical in this sense. This supports Destiny's point. However, the next point does not, because they're at the opposite sides of the spectrum when it comes to potential. The comatose patient no longer has the potential to regain consciousness. Destiny made that clear in his analogy, but the fetus does. This is why the two women here value the fetus differently. And this is also why we instinctively see developing fetuses and dead people, even though still on life support, differently, because they are different.
That's why I said capacity to deploy consciousness. I can wake you up when you're sleeping.
Like the fetus has capacity.
No, a fetus that doesn't have the necessary brain parts has
Destiny,
no capacity for consciousness.
If you give that child time, that child
Give the
innately
child time
has
implies-
capacity.
Wait, you said 20 to 24 weeks. What about children?
Hold on.
Who
Wait.
have REM
Just you
cycle
saying,
sleep
hold on.
at
Wait.
18 weeks.
Wait. Just what you said there. Give the child time implies that it's
Give
not
me time
there
to
yet.
wake up.
Do you think that a seed and a tree are the same thing?
You're making a wrong equivalency.
Actually, this isn't a wrong equivalency. It's actually on a 1-1 scale. Destiny's analogy works perfectly, just not the way he thinks. It's obvious that the seed and the tree aren't the same thing. In the same manner, the fetus isn't a child, a teenager, or an adult. But do you see the problem here? It's semantic first and foremost. The seed and the tree may not be the same thing, but they're both the same organism. They're different developmental phases of the same organism. In this context, destroying the seed isn't the same as destroying the tree naturally because the tree doesn't exist yet. What we call tree is the organism's final developmental phase. But destroying the seed does destroy the organism, which prevents the emergence of the tree to begin with. Destiny thinks only the tree is worth protecting, not the seed. The problem is that the tree cannot become without being a seed first.
So the question doesn't make sense. What I'm saying it's a meaningless question.
How do you feel very strongly about being pro-choice when you can't even tell us at what point you think a child has this extra special consciousness that deserves the right to life in the womb?
Why would that prohibit me from...
You don't know when consciousness exists, when it actually comes...
You won't even say when
the baby has consciousness.
I've given you the range of when different people develop at different rates. It's about 20 to 24 weeks.
So you want to create, so you believe that we should have a sliding scale of what it means to be a human person.
We already have that sliding scale. We do it at death. That's why when we go back to the... I'm going to ask again... No, I'm not answering the question until you answer this question.
Do you think it's okay to kill someone when they're unconscious?
No, because I said capacity to deploy consciousness.
What do you mean by capacity to deploy consciousness?
As in all of the parts in your brain are functioning and working and can deploy a conscious experience.
So an embryo who is developing their brain will absolutely have the capacity to...
Will implies it doesn't yet.
Right, so my big problem here is that Destiny uses capacity with the definition of that which already exists. In other words, having the capacity for consciousness is the same as having consciousness. It's like saying a woman has the capacity for pregnancy only when she's pregnant. I don't agree with this definition in this context because it's limiting and it changes the goalposts. That's because whether it has consciousness or not, it's undoubtedly true that the fetus has the capacity, as in the potential, for developing it. In the same manner, a woman with capacity to bear children is one who can become pregnant and produce children. The real problem here is semantical. Destiny simply has a different definition for capacity that eliminates the notion of potential. Now, don't get me wrong, the word capacity primarily refers to the amount present or that which already exists, like a mug has the capacity to hold water. In this definition, the notion of potential doesn't exist because it is already actualized. So I'm not saying that Destiny is using a definition that doesn't exist or is misusing the word. What I am saying is that he's using capacity with this specific definition intentionally to separate the pre-20 week and the post-20 week fetus. By doing so, the pre-20 week fetus doesn't fall under Destiny's definition because it lacks the capacity for consciousness as he defines it. This distinction becomes even more relevant in the following segment.
This thing will become this thing. The implication there is your intuition pumping all the rights that this thing has for saying this will become
Incorrect.
this.
Incorrect. A child in the womb, a human being, has the capacity for consciousness.
No, it doesn't.
They might not have developed that capacity.
That means they don't have the capacity
They might not
for
have
it.
developed that capacity.
There, you see? Lila first says that a child in the womb has the capacity for consciousness. But literally 3 seconds later she says they might not have developed that capacity yet. This sounds like a contradiction, but is not. The segment shows her using the same word with 2 different meanings. The first use refers to capacity as in the potential to grow consciousness, and then she uses it again, this time with the meaning of that which already exists, as in the consciousness is already present, which is how Destiny is using it. So my real problem here is that Destiny's choice to use the notion of capacity for consciousness defined this way is entirely subjective and even irrational. Don't worry, I'll explain why shortly.
Your question was if a child is prematurely born at 16 weeks, the mother and the father have every right to try to find support for that child. Why would you not?
But why? What makes that child
because it's going to grow into their kid. Why would they not?
Of care.
But you're...
Right. But here's the problem. Your stance is that fetuses should only receive human rights at a minimum when they're 20 weeks old. So your statement that in the case of a 16-week-old born prematurely, the parents have every right to fight for the baby because he will grow into their child, that's just a red herring, isn't it? Because the real issue being discussed is, do you consider a 16-week-old baby to have human rights? Given that the fetus is below the 20-week threshold, does this mean that the parents can just, kill it? We already know that they have the right to fight for it, but this wasn't the point, was it? This is an interesting dodge here because it allows Destiny to avoid the obvious contradiction. If he claimed that once born, the 16-week-old fetus does have the right to life, he would have had to face the natural question of, so why not provide the fetus the same right while still in the womb? Nothing really changes during a premature birth in the fetus's development. The fetus still doesn't have consciousness because it's below the 20-week threshold. This would be a difficult setup to engage in, So Destiny prefers to just use a sleight of hand red herring to find his way out of trouble. Quite a shame that the two didn't catch on it. However, he could have simply answered no. The baby doesn't have the right to life at 16 weeks old, even when born prematurely, right? So why didn't he? Well, I think it's because of the emotional impact. An abortion procedure is a medical intervention. This makes it somewhat colder, more impersonal, which gives us the luxury of calling it, well, an abortion. But once the fetus or the baby is out of the womb and healthy, and we know for a fact, or at least beyond a reasonable doubt, that it will survive with some assistance, ending its life qualifies as what? Can't call it an abortion anymore. Murder comes to mind, am I right? Which is why we prosecute women who kill their fetuses in the case of accidental miscarriages. And Destiny is not stupid, so he can't really call that situation an abortion because it really isn't. But he also can't say that the 16-week-old born prematurely should get the right to life now that he's born, because that would conflict with his overall stance that fetuses should only be granted the right to life when they reach 20 weeks of age.
So here's a question, for instance. A lot of women have miscarriages, like without even knowing in the first few weeks of getting pregnant. Do you think that those embryos should be rushed to the hospital?
Well, if the embryo is dead, no. I mean,
okay, but do you think that like any woman, do you think we should start locking every single woman that has sex into some sort of facility to check for early miscarriages like that? Because if it is true, wouldn't that be the equivalent of a woman leaving a child starving to death on their floor?
No, absolutely not.
No.
how dare you?
Hold on, can you answer the question?
How dare you?
Because what you're talking about right now is essentially the real genocide of children is all the children being miscarried right now in the first few weeks of development. That's horrible.
I think this is one of the stupidest arguments I've ever heard. Destiny really equated accidental miscarriages with the act of intentionally leaving your child to starve to death. There's obviously a critical difference between the two scenarios, and that's the intent to cause harm, which only exists in the latter. Don't be like Destiny.
The difference is there's a difference between a thing and a thing that something will become. Those are two fundamentally different things. So when you say, what's the difference between a fetus that hasn't developed the parts to have consciousness yet versus what's the difference between me...
The fetus...
I told you she wouldn't let me finish. Versus what's the difference between me who's currently unconscious and will become conscious later after anesthesia will wake up. The difference is you're not developing the capacity to have consciousness. There's a continuation of a prior conscious experience. All the parts are there to create a conscious experience. They're just temporarily alleviated. They're just... No, it's not, because the fetus has never been conscious and doesn't have the parts to deploy the conscious experience. So there's fundamentally a difference. Was that 2 or 3 interruptions that I said were going to happen, right? There's fundamentally a difference between a thing doesn't even have the capability to have a conscious experience versus somebody else's is temporarily abated by a drug. That is the difference.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Why does the continuation of consciousness matter?
The continuation matters because the thing I'm valuing is the underlying machinery that has the capacity to deploy a conscious experience. Why? Because in all the intuition of when we talk about other people and things, it seems like, well, ultimately that's kind of where our morals come from, don't they? Right? And at the end of the day, the thing that we seem to be valuing in other people seems to be the subjective experience that we're all having with each other.
Okay, this was a mouthful of a presentation, so I'll try to keep it short. Destiny explains the difference in value between the fetus and the comatose patient by virtue of the patient already having the hardware for consciousness, while the fetus does not. Nothing new here. The interesting part comes when Lila asks why he is valuing the continuation of consciousness, which is only present in the comatose patient. A clearer version of his answer would be because that's what we value in other people, the subjective experiences we're having with each other, which relate to the presence of consciousness naturally. The problem is that Destiny only protects the continuation of consciousness once consciousness has arrived. But the process of formation begins pretty much at conception. The entire developmental phase of the fetus consists of layers upon layers adding on top of the other to create a progressively more complex human being that will ultimately grow the hardware necessary to produce consciousness. It's a continuous process that Destiny decides to cut in half at the 20-week mark and only value what comes after, completely unjustifiably so.
Because you keep saying that earlier, and we can rewind the tapes or whatever, that the child doesn't have the capacity for consciousness. But the child does have the capacity to have consciousness. At the moment of conception, all is there.
That's not the parts. A blueprint is not a part.
Go ahead.
If I walked outside and there was 100 steel beams, and there was a ton of nails and all this shit laying on the ground, and it was organized, and I walk over and I push over the steel beams, nobody would say, oh my God, you just destroyed a building. All the parts for the building are there. The blueprint might be there to build the building.
It would still be vandalism.
Yeah, but it's not a building.
This is another false analogy on Destiny's part because it's twofold wrong. To put it simply, Destiny is right that pushing and destroying the materials of a building before the building is made isn't the same as destroying the building that's already built. The problem is that knocking over the materials or even destroying them completely won't prevent the formation of the building. The exact same building as in the blueprint. You simply buy other materials, exactly the same. The fetus, once destroyed, it remains destroyed. You cannot create a new identical fetus because each DNA is unique. For all intents and purposes, you have destroyed that person before the person was even formed. So, a better building analogy would be you destroying and preventing anyone from ever using that blueprint to create that specific building. In that case, for all intents and purposes, you have destroyed the building before it was formed, even if you didn't practically do it. This is the first issue. The second issue is that the blueprint and the building are two separate things. But what Destiny calls blueprint in the case of the fetus is actually the fetus itself in an early developmental phase. In the fetus's case, the fetus is both the blueprint and the thing being built. These two issues make the building analogy completely flawed. Okay, so before I summarize my thoughts, here are two separate segments from two separate debates that Destiny has had on the same topic before. The first one is with a young lady called...
Ayola. Aioli. Miss Ayatollah, please.
Just call me Ayatollah.
Sorry, how do you pronounce your name again?
I don't understand why you have these discussions with people and acts like you are a rational, objective actor and that you're just trying to have a conversation. Like, you've continuously disrespected me. You just call me Ayatollah. I guess I just don't understand, like, why you wouldn't err on the side of caution with our emerging
well, sure, because we're balancing out we're balancing out things here, and we're balancing out the rights of women and the right to their body to not be eaten by another organism for a little bit, basically, and to undergo certain health effects. We're talking about that, and then we're weighing that against the potential life of a child, right? So if it is the case that a child is living and is a person at some, 1 week old or the moment of conception, then the autonomy of the mother takes a big backseat to that, which I think is agreeable. I think most of us would agree with that. But if that's not the case, and it is just a thing until about 20 weeks, and then there's experience worth protecting, we are condemning women to basically cede control of their bodies to the state or to other people to say that they can't do certain things to have bodily autonomy because of a thing, right?
This shows that Destiny values the life of a child with consciousness, so a person, more than the right of the mother to her bodily autonomy, as he naturally should. The issue is that he doesn't expand that before the 20-week mark, because what we have there isn't a child but a thing. By doing so, he separates the human fetus from the human fetus with consciousness the same way he did with the blueprint and the building, not realizing in the process that one is the extension of the other instead of two separate things. This brings us to the second clip, which is a debate between him and Matt Dillahunty, whose stance on abortion is even more extreme, to put it like that.
Okay, so I'm going to reference. So here's a question I have. Okay, so going back to this 2013 paper by the Steve Wagner guy, he posits Mary's cabin. So a woman wakes up and she finds out that she is in a blizzard. She's locked in a cabin for 6 weeks, and she'd just given birth to a baby. She wakes up, she looks over for everything, finds a note, and it says, "Listen, your child is in another place and it's safe. There's another child in another room. You have all the food and supplies that you need, but for 6 weeks, you're going to be locked in this cabin, and that baby's with you. You're there. We'll let you out in 6 weeks. Everything will be okay." In 6 weeks, the police show up to the house. They plow all the snow. They open the door. Mary comes out, and they say, "Oh my goodness, we've got you. The Association of Behavioral Psychologists kidnapped you for an experiment. We're so sorry. We're going to bring you out. How are you guys doing?" And she says, "I'm doing fine." And they're like, "Well, how's the baby?" And she says, "They're not here anymore." And the question is, what happened to the baby? And she says, "Oh, well, I let the baby starve. I didn't want to feed it." I'm like, well, you had all the means and opportunity to. You were the only one that could have. The question is did she have an obligation to provide nourishment for the child while she was there and the only one that could? And I feel like this is a closer analogy to pregnancy than the violin argument, because you you are the only one that could provide nourishment to that child for those 6 weeks. It couldn't be any random person's kidney there. You have the ability to do it. You would have to breastfeed, right? So it's some obligation to your body to use it in a way that's like kind of natural. Breastfeeding is more natural than hooking people's kidneys up to each other. And I feel like when most people look at this, and I am relying a bit on moral intuition here, I do admit, but I'm looking at this de facto guardianship idea. I don't think most people would be comfortable saying like, well, it's not her kid, and yeah, if she really wanted to just kind of chill there and let the kid starve, it's okay because, that kid doesn't have a right to her body. I think people would say, well, in that case, she's the only one that can provide it. She does have not just a moral, virtuous action, but like an actual moral duty, a moral obligation there to provide for the safety and the nourishment of that child.
Destiny's point here is in response to Matt's position, who is a full-blown late-term abortionist. Never go full-blown late-term abortionist, by the way. Either way, what Destiny is saying is that, similar to the cabin situation, a pregnant woman should have the moral obligation under the guise of de facto guardianship to keep the baby until it's born, and until someone else can take over her duty in case she doesn't want the baby anymore, which is the correct stance to take. Based on these two final clips, as well as all the other clips, here is my stance. Destiny claimed during this video that he's willing to protect the continuation of consciousness, which is why people who sleep or are in a coma that we know they'll wake up from don't lose their right to life. And he does that because of I somewhat quote here, we value the subjective experiences we're having with people in general. But this is where things get paradoxical, because Destiny is also willing to protect the 20-week-old fetus, despite not being any continuation of consciousness here. There was no consciousness present before the 20-week mark, was it? So you can't say you value the 20-week-old fetus because you value the subjective experiences you have with people. You've never had and can't have any meaningful subjective experience with a 20-week-old fetus. So, in reality, by protecting the 20-week-old fetus, you're actually protecting something that will become something else, something more evolved, if you wish, with which you can have meaningful subjective experiences. That would be, at a minimum, a newborn. And you can't have a newborn without protecting the 20-week-old person first. Knowing this, the only way to remain consistent and call your stance rational is to expand your protection before the 20-week mark as well. You should also protect the fetus because the fetus is also something that will become something else that you value. And you can't have a 20-week-old person without protecting the pre-20-week fetus first. Value the fetus humanity first if you want it to become a person. Value the seed if you want to get a tree. To state it even more plainly, Destiny thinks that the de facto guardianship should come into effect at the 20-week mark. I say it should come into effect at the moment of conception, for all the reasons I've already mentioned. Alright, so that's about it, I guess. If you like the content, smash the like button, comment, share, everything to help with the algorithm. Until next time.